Spain 1492, a young girl screams in a candlelit chapel as priests chant to expel a demon. The shocking truth. Medieval church rituals around exorcisms often targeted the vulnerable, women, the poor, or the mentally ill, to enforce control. These ceremonies weren't just spiritual, they were public spectacles meant to terrify communities into submission. The human value of empathy was ignored as possessed individuals were chained, starved, or beaten to save their souls. Some exorcists even fabricated possessions to gain fame or wealth. You'll be floored to learn how these rituals exploited fear and suffering under the guise of divine intervention. Keep watching to expose the haunting reality of the Church's darkest practices. Castile, 1480. The air is thick with incense as a crowd gathers outside a stone church, whispers of demonic possession spreading like wildfire. The medieval church wasn't merely a place of worship, it was a stage for control, and exorcism was its most terrifying performance. Imagine this, a young woman, barely 16, accused of being possessed because she dared to question a priest's authority. Her screams echo through the village as she's dragged into the church, her fate sealed not by evidence but by fear. This wasn't an isolated incident. Exorcisms, often cloaked in divine purpose, were weaponized to silence dissent, enforce obedience, and maintain the Church's iron grip over medieval Europe. Let's set the scene. The Middle Ages were a time of chaos, plagues, wars, and famines left people desperate for answers. The Church, claiming to hold the keys to salvation, stepped in with rituals that promised protection from unseen evils. But here's the shocking truth, exorcisms weren't always about saving souls. They were public performances, designed to instill fear and submission. The vulnerable, women, the poor, the mentally ill, were prime targets. Why? Because they were least likely to resist. A widow with no family, a beggar with strange mutterings, or a girl with seizures could be branded possessed, with no defense. The Church's authority went unchallenged, and the crowd's fear grew with every chant. What did these rituals look like? Picture a dimly lit chapel, cold stone walls dripping with wax from flickering candles. Priests in heavy robes circle a trembling figure, often tied down or chained to prevent escape. Latin chants fill the air, unintelligible to most, adding to the mystery and terror. Holy water is splashed, crucifixes are thrust forward, and sometimes, the possessed, are beaten or starved to weaken the demon. The crowd outside, peering through cracked doors, sees not a person but a spectacle, a warning of what happens to those who stray. The human value of empathy was buried under the weight of dogma. Instead of care, these victims faced torment, their suffering paraded as proof of the Church's power. But here's where it gets darker. Some exorcists fabricated possessions for personal gain. A charismatic priest could rise to fame, drawing pilgrims who paid for blessings or relics to ward off demons. In 1456, a monk in Florence was caught staging an exorcism on a young boy, claiming a demon spoke through him, only to be exposed when the boy confessed it was a rehearsed act for coin. Yet, the Church rarely punished such frauds. Why? Because the fear they generated kept people in line. The human cost, lives ruined, families torn apart, was ignored in favor of power. This wasn't just about individuals. Entire communities were manipulated. In 1374, a village in Germany saw a wave of possessions after a failed harvest. The local clergy declared it divine punishment, performing mass exorcisms that drew crowds from miles away. People donated their last coins for protection, believing the Church was their only shield. The reality? These rituals enriched the Church while sowing division, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a hunt for the possessed. The value of community, meant to uplift, was twisted into paranoia. By the late 15th century, exorcisms had become a cultural obsession. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, fueled the frenzy, offering step-by-step guides for identifying and curing possession. These texts, endorsed by the Church, blurred the line between spiritual and physical punishment. A woman with epilepsy could be chained for days, her seizures labeled as demonic. A man grieving his family's death might be flogged to expel his despair. The Church's claim of divine authority masked a brutal truth: these rituals exploited human suffering to maintain control. As we dive deeper, you'll see how this obsession with demons wasn't merely a product of ignorance, it was a deliberate tool. The Church's rituals, meant to embody faith and hope, instead sowed fear and division. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking details of how these practices shaped medieval society and left scars that linger even today. France, 1410. A packed church square watches as a man writhes on the ground, priests shouting prayers over his convulsing body. This wasn't a private act of salvation, it was a public execution of the spirit. Medieval exorcisms were theatrical, designed to captivate and terrify. The Church didn't merely perform these rituals, it staged them, turning human suffering into a grim spectacle that reinforced its dominance. Let's peel back the curtain on how these ceremonies manipulated entire communities, crushing the human value of dignity in the process. Picture a typical exorcism. The setting is dramatic: a church bathed in shadows, incense curling through the air, and a crowd buzzing with dread and fascination. The possessed person, often a marginalized figure like a beggar or a woman accused of witchcraft, is the centerpiece. They're restrained, sometimes with ropes or chains, their cries drowned out by booming Latin chants. Priests wield crosses, splash holy water, and recite prayers that sound holy but often serve to heighten the drama. The goal? To convince the audience that the Church alone can battle the forces of evil. The victim's humanity is erased, they become a prop in a terrifying morality play. But why the spectacle? The Church thrived on fear. In an era of uncertainty, with plagues like the Black Death wiping out villages, people craved reassurance. Exorcisms offered a visible fight against chaos, proof that the Church could protect them. Yet, this came at a cost. The vulnerable were exploited, their pain turned into entertainment. In 1423, a young girl in Spain was subjected to a week-long exorcism, her body bruised from purifying beatings. The crowd cheered when she finally confessed to demonic influence, unaware she'd been coerced to end her suffering. The value of dignity was sacrificed for the Church's image. Shockingly, some exorcisms were outright staged. In 1470, a priest in Italy was exposed for paying a woman to fake possession, complete with convulsions and demonic voices. The performance drew hundreds, each paying for blessings or indulgences. When the truth emerged, the priest faced no punishment, his superiors profited too. This wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, clergy used exorcisms to boost their status or fund church projects. Cathedrals rose on the backs of the poor, who gave their last coins to escape the demons the Church itself amplified. The psychological toll was devastating. Families of the possessed were ostracized, labeled as cursed. In 1398, a village in England shunned a family after their daughter's exorcism, believing her cured but still tainted. Children were sometimes taken from parents, subjected to rituals that left them traumatized or dead. The Church's promise of salvation came with a hidden price: the destruction of trust and community. Instead of fostering love, these rituals bred suspicion, as neighbors turned on each other to avoid being next. The Church also used exorcisms to target specific groups. Women, especially those who defied norms, were frequent victims. A healer using herbs could be branded a witch, her knowledge twisted into proof of demonic influence. In 1490, a midwife in France was subjected to an exorcism after a stillbirth, accused of cursing the child. Her screams during the ritual were called demonic, but they were cries of pain. The human value of justice was abandoned, replaced by a system that punished difference. By the late Middle Ages, exorcisms had become a cultural phenomenon, feeding into the witch hunts that would soon engulf Europe. The Church's rituals laid the groundwork, normalizing the idea that anyone could be a vessel for evil. This wasn't just about faith, it was about power. The Church's ability to label and punish the possessed gave it control over body and soul. As we move forward, we'll explore how these rituals intertwined with other church practices, creating a web of fear that ensnared entire societies. Germany, 1450. A priest stands before a trembling congregation, holding up a vial of holy water said to banish demons. The medieval church didn't merely perform exorcisms, it built an entire system around them, a machinery of control that exploited fear to dominate society. From relics to indulgences, every ritual was a cog in a wheel designed to keep people submissive. Let's uncover the shocking mechanics of how the church turned spiritual rituals into tools of oppression, trampling the human value of trust. Exorcisms were part of a broader ecosystem of church rituals, each reinforcing the other. Take relics, bones, hair, or objects supposedly tied to saints. These were sold as protection against demons, often at exorbitant prices. In 1465, a church in Italy claimed to possess St. Peter's finger, charging pilgrims to touch it for spiritual cleansing. The truth? Many relics were fakes, sourced from unmarked graves or even animals. The church knew this but encouraged the trade, profiting from the desperate. Trust, a cornerstone of human connection, was betrayed as people poured their faith into lies. Indulgences were another piece of the puzzle. These pardons for sins were sold with promises of salvation or protection from possession. In 1476, a Dominican friar in Spain sold indulgences to fund a cathedral, claiming they'd shield buyers from demons. The poor, unable to pay, were left vulnerable, told their suffering was divine punishment. This wasn't faith, it was extortion. The church preyed on fear, turning spiritual hope into a transaction. The value of fairness was crushed as the wealthy bought their way to purity, while the poor faced damnation. Exorcism manuals, like the Rituale Romanum precursors, were another tool. These texts, circulated among clergy, detailed how to identify and expel demons. But they weren't just spiritual guides, they were scripts for control. A priest could label any behavior as demonic, from rebellion to mental illness. In 1488, a man in France was exorcised for questioning church taxes, his dissent framed as Satan's work. These manuals gave clergy unchecked power, letting them punish without evidence. The human value of reason was discarded, replaced by superstition dressed as doctrine. The church also used exorcisms to reinforce gender roles. Women were disproportionately targeted, their emotions or independence seen as gateways for demons. In 1495, a woman in England was exorcised after refusing an arranged marriage, her defiance labeled as possession. The ritual humiliated her, forcing public submission. Men, too, faced scrutiny, especially those who challenged church authority. A merchant in 1430 was accused of demonic influence for criticizing a bishop's wealth, subjected to a grueling exorcism that left him broken. These rituals weren't about salvation, they were about enforcing conformity. Communities suffered as much as individuals. Exorcisms created a culture of suspicion, where anyone could be accused. In 1415, a village in Spain saw a wave of possessions after a drought, with neighbors accusing each other to deflect blame. The church fueled this paranoia, performing mass exorcisms that enriched its coffers while tearing communities apart. The value of unity was shattered, replaced by a climate of fear where trust was a luxury. The church's rituals also had a darker economic motive. Exorcisms drew crowds, and crowds brought money. Pilgrims paid for blessings, relics, or a chance to witness the miracle of a demon's expulsion. In 1472, a cathedral in France hosted weekly exorcisms, each a spectacle that filled its treasury. The suffering of the possessed was secondary to the profit. This commodification of faith turned sacred spaces into marketplaces, betraying the very values the church claimed to uphold. As we move to the next part, we'll see how these rituals didn't just control the present, they shaped the future, laying the groundwork for the witch hunts and religious wars that would engulf Europe. The church's grip on fear was tightening, and the consequences were catastrophic. Italy, 1500. A crowd watches as a woman is led from a church, her exorcism complete but her spirit broken. The medieval church's rituals didn't just harm individuals, they left a lasting scar on society, setting the stage for centuries of persecution. Exorcisms weren't isolated acts, they were the foundation for a culture of fear that fueled witch hunts, inquisitions, and religious division. Let's explore the shocking legacy of these rituals and how they eroded the human value of compassion. By the late Middle Ages, exorcisms had normalized the idea that evil could lurk in anyone. This belief, amplified by the Church, created a society obsessed with rooting out demons. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, a church-endorsed text, didn't just guide exorcisms, it became a blueprint for the witch hunts. Women, especially those who defied norms, were prime targets. A healer in 1498 France was accused of witchcraft after a failed exorcism, burned at the stake to cleanse her soul. Her crime? Using herbs to treat illness, which the Church called demonic. Compassion, the heart of human connection, was replaced by paranoia. The Inquisition, born from the same fear-driven mindset, turned exorcisms into legal weapons. In Spain, 1492, the Spanish Inquisition used possession as evidence of heresy. Thousands faced torture or death, their exorcisms serving as public warnings. The Church claimed these acts protected society, but they destroyed lives. Families were torn apart, with children orphaned and communities fractured. In 1480, a village in Germany lost a third of its women to accusations of possession, their exorcisms ending in execution. The value of mercy was absent, replaced by a ruthless quest for purity. Exorcisms also fueled religious division. As the Reformation loomed, Catholic exorcisms were used to prove superiority over emerging Protestant faiths. In 1510, a Catholic priest in England performed a public exorcism to discredit Protestant critics, claiming their doubts invited demons. Protestants responded with their own rituals, accusing Catholics of idolatry. This back-and-forth escalated tensions, contributing to the religious wars that would kill thousands. The human value of tolerance was crushed as faith became a battleground. The psychological impact was profound. Exorcisms left survivors traumatized, their reputations ruined. In 1494, a boy in Italy was exorcised for demonic fits, likely epilepsy, leaving him unable to speak for years. His family, shunned as cursed, fled their village. The Church offered no support, its focus on spectacle over care. This neglect extended to entire communities, where fear of possession lingered long after the rituals ended. Neighbors stopped trusting each other, and the Church's promise of salvation felt hollow. Economically, the legacy was equally grim. The Church's reliance on exorcisms and related rituals created a cycle of exploitation. Pilgrimage sites, built on the fame of successful exorcisms, drew the desperate, who paid for relics or blessings. In 1505, a shrine in Spain claimed to house a demon-expelling relic, charging pilgrims their life savings. When the relic was exposed as a fraud, the Church deflected blame, leaving the poor destitute. The value of honesty was sacrificed for profit, a pattern that persisted for centuries. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance, the Church's rituals began to face scrutiny. Scholars like Erasmus questioned the validity of exorcisms, pointing to their human cost. Yet, the damage was done. The fear sown by these rituals had reshaped society, creating a legacy of suspicion and division. As we head to the final part, we'll reflect on how these practices still echo in modern beliefs and what they reveal about the power of fear over faith. Europe, 1520. The age of exorcisms is waning, but their shadow looms large. The medieval Church's rituals, particularly exorcisms, didn't just shape their time, they left a haunting legacy that still influences how we view faith, fear, and human suffering. Let's uncover the shocking ways these practices resonate today, exposing the fragility of the human values they trampled: empathy, trust, and justice. The most immediate legacy was the witch hunts, which exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries. Exorcisms had primed society to see evil everywhere. The Malleus Maleficarum and similar texts, rooted in exorcism practices, became manuals for identifying witches. In 1563, a woman in England was executed after an exorcism failed to cure her outspoken nature, labeled as demonic. Thousands more faced similar fates, their lives erased by a system that saw difference as danger. The compassion that should have protected them was replaced by fear-driven judgment, a direct descendant of medieval rituals. The Church's use of exorcisms also shaped modern perceptions of mental illness. In the Middle Ages, conditions like epilepsy, schizophrenia, or depression were often labeled as possession. Exorcisms, with their brutal methods, offered no healing, only trauma. In 1515, a man in France was chained for weeks during an exorcism, his demonic fits later identified as seizures. Today, while science has advanced, the stigma lingers. Some communities still view mental illness with suspicion, a faint echo of the Church's fear-mongering. The value of understanding was undermined, leaving scars that persist. Religiously, exorcisms sowed seeds of division that still grow. The Catholic-Protestant split was fueled by competing claims of spiritual authority, with exorcisms as a flashpoint. In 1521, a Catholic exorcism in Germany was used to denounce Protestant reformers, escalating tensions that led to war. Today, debates over exorcism continue in some religious circles, with certain groups clinging to medieval practices. This divisiveness undermines the human value of unity, showing how fear can fracture faith. Economically, the Church's exploitation left a lasting distrust. The sale of relics, indulgences, and exorcism-related blessings created a model of spiritual profiteering. In 1500, a monastery in Italy was exposed for selling demon-repelling amulets, yet faced no consequences. This eroded trust in religious institutions, a skepticism that persists in modern critiques of organized religion. The value of integrity was sacrificed, leaving a legacy of doubt. Culturally, exorcisms shaped our fascination with the supernatural. From medieval chronicles to modern horror films, the image of the possessed being saved by a priest endures. While entertaining, this romanticizes a brutal practice, ignoring the suffering it caused. In 1499, a girl in Spain died during an exorcism, her death celebrated as a victory over evil. Today's media rarely shows this grim reality, perpetuating a sanitized version of a dark history. The human value of truth is obscured, replaced by sensationalism. What can we learn from this? The medieval Church's rituals reveal the power of fear to corrupt even the most sacred institutions. They exploited the vulnerable, eroded trust, and divided communities, all under the guise of salvation. Yet, they also show the resilience of human values. Despite the Church's abuses, people like the scholars of the Renaissance began questioning these practices, paving the way for reform. Their courage reminds us that empathy, justice, and truth can prevail, even in the darkest times. As we close, reflect on this: the shocking truth behind medieval Church rituals isn't just a story of the past. It's a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and fear. The screams of the possessed echo through history, urging us to protect the vulnerable and uphold the values that make us human. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the Church's darkest practices. Stay curious, and never stop questioning.